want you to take me through just a brief overview of the chapter breakdowns. What were your major findings, and what major lessons can we draw from the book?
Okay, thank you for that question. Well, when I wrote the book, I knew that South Africa would be one of my case studies, which is chapter 4, and also chapter 5 being, or is it chapter 6? Oh no, chapter 5 for the Ethiopian case, and also Ghana being chapter 6, and the final one is economic diversification. But the first chapter really, it breaks down what sovereign risk is, because in the discourse of debt crisis, I don't know if it's because I'm a political risk scholar, whereby I'm more enticed to know what happens before a risk emanates. So I wanted to find out or try to break down what sovereign risk is, in particular, the types of sovereign risks that you have, and why they happen. A number of examples of what is debt repudiation, what is debt structuring, whereby a state might have willingness to pay for the debt, but they might not have the availability or ability to do so. And then there's a reverse side of it, whereby they might have the money to service a debt, but they might not want to service the debt. So I wanted to understand what are some of these implications if you are going to lend and not want to pay the debt back, And I was also gushed with a number of theoretical approaches, when doing research, still within chapter 1, whereby you will find out that Keynesian economists will tell you that debt is a good thing. They appreciate debt because they feel like it's an additional revenue. It's money from heaven, and you should appreciate it and spend it as much as you can, or in whatever way that you can. But from a Marxist approach, debt crisis or public debt or borrowing as a government means that you will have some people paying for it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you this in the case of South Africa. If you're going to take out money, right, from a certain lender, you will find out that you will have to pay for it in one way or another. And one way to pay it is over taxation, right? It's over taxation, which then lowers the standards of living within your country. That's where you'll start having riots all over the place, some level of unsatisfactory with the living conditions within that country. So now what you find out is that, and this has been a big thing, right? Especially with the G20 coming to South Africa this year, whereby we are more concerned about the debt servicing costs instead of the debt itself. Because there's a higher debt servicing cost that comes with servicing debt. And also, something that we should notice the fact that, and it will show within the next chapters that I'm going to speak about, how there's these debt servicing costs, but also remember you are paying a debt in your currency, which might be weaker than the currency in which you borrowed the debt in the first place. So if you're going to use the rand or you're going to use the Ethiopian birr to pay a US dollar, it becomes higher, right? So the debt itself, coupled with the debt servicing costs themselves, it now becomes quite unsustainable for government to actually pay and service the debt on time or in a very in a manner that enables them not to cripple on their economy or to not even reprioritize some of their budgets within the state apparatus, right? Within the fiscus or the government budgeting system. So that was the first chapter in which I wanted to understand what debt servicing is, what is a sovereign risk, and some of the case studies that we're going to discuss. And then I came to chapter 2, right? Then chapter 2 was on the historical, the history of debt in Africa, if it's not the political economy, right? And within the history, I learned so much. That's why I got to learn that, debt was something that was, it's quite historic, That's hence I will argue that many of our countries, in Africa, they were set for independence.
Mm-hmm.
Ghana being the first one in 1957, but their economies were never independent. They were never. They remained incarcerated and to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And I showed this in a series of showing how colonialism transcended into what we would call. So there was a transatlantic slavery. There was colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
There was also globalization, right?
Mm-hmm.
Globalization is a beautiful, harmonious idea when you look at it. But in reality, what you find is many of the African states, they were exposed to a globalized neoliberal economic system, right, in which they were marginalized. They were exposed to that at a very infant stage, right? So they were toddling around that time. What I'm trying to say is those economies were not strong enough to have partnerships or even trade agreements with the external world, right? And that was one thing that I found out to say that they didn't have time to transform their economies on time, in order for those economies to be on par with whatever partnering counterparts, countries that they will be in partnership with. So the moment they were globalized, they were now exposed to this big capitalist system that looked harmonious, but that system would still render for the interests of the external world than they would for African economies, right? Because now they were exposed at an early stage. But also the history itself, in which there was a time whereby debt was cancelled, right? Many of the African states, the debt was cancelled. So African economies adopted a very sluggish economies, right, from their colonies. Very sluggish. They did less work in transforming those economies. And by transformation, I'm now referring to ensuring that the economy is diversified enough to compensate for external, internal economic, geo-economic shocks, right? Whereby when you have a food insecurity, or whereby when the oil prices are now fluctuating, they're turbulent, you should have a different sector of the economy which can compensate for the fluctuation itself. But no, that is not the case within the African states. So what you find is you have a series of African states that suffered from drought, right? They took out a loan, and taking up the loan, after taking up the loan, they service whatever it is that they are servicing, the famine or whatever it is. After that, because their economies are so weak, those are weak commodity export economies. They go back, the money that is revenued or the money that is solicited from those exports services the debt, but not enough to ensure that they sustainably service the debt.